What the heck is up, sports fans? I'm your host with the moster, Dusty O'Connell, and joining me is eminent Minnesota Vikings football analyst, Arif Hassan, and you're listening to Norse Code.
That's gotta be unusual for our halfway new listeners. This Dusty guy.
Come on, why would you listen to this show when there's at least 30 other Minnesota Vikings podcasts? But hey, we're the OG podcast with the OG crew again. I was actually going to save kind of the big reveal until next week, but just the timing of everything worked out such that I get an early start. But I will be returning to my regular hosterly duties of the preview episodes this season. I thought to myself, the Vikings are probably going to go 9-6. This should be interesting.
9-6, and then the other game is not going to be decided. Is that?
Yep. Just cover the mediocre Minnesota Vikings for a year, so I don't have to put any of this, emotional stress on myself when we blow it at the very end.
Smart move. You killed it.
I'm planning ahead. Well, and plus it's like we're in the, according to Conan O'Brien, we're in the era of peak podcast, and I would be remiss if I did not attempt to dip my toe back in the water after investing, 5 years of my life into this nonsense before taking a break. But I've got a new agent now. I'm locked into a 1 year. I got picked up at the very end of the free agent period. I got a sweet 1 year deal. And we're talking. So I specifically wanted to avoid having to talk preseason because it's pretty boring. But if you're gonna jump in the preseason, it should probably be in the job interview game, which is basically where we're at now.
Right.
But yeah, I want to take just one quick second to suggest to everybody very kindly that in advance of this season, you throw us a few bucks for any value you feel you may receive from this show. Patreon.com/NorseCode is where you want to go if you want to be a recurring subscriber in basically any dollar amount you choose. But we strongly recommend the $3.50 a month donation level. I mean, if you felt like one episode really, really tickled you, really appealed to you, or if you want to bribe James and Arif to get me off the show again, a one-time donation in any amount you desire can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode. Norse Code remains commercial-free thanks to the devotion of listeners and sponsors like all of you out there. So thank you, everybody who has thrown money at us in the past and all of you who continue to subscribe. And we eagerly welcome those who choose to join the Norse Code family. So turning our attention to the game against Arizona, the Vikings remain undefeated in the preseason for whatever that's worth, but it sure didn't look like we were going to be able to pull it off after the first half. Just a lot of what felt like miscues and just general lack of communication, especially with the offense in the first half.
Yeah, it really felt like the offense was out of sync. I mean, there was like a couple of problems when the offense did find a way to kind of break open the potential for a big play, Stephon Diggs open deep. You ended up having a wildly inaccurate deep throw, which Cousins isn't really awful on deep throws or anything like that. So that was unusual and unfortunate to see. And then other times, you have a pre-delegated read, which is like a screen, and that gets blown up behind the line of scrimmage. So sometimes, the defense clearly knew what the offense was doing, which, if no one is game planning, and I still maintain that despite what they say, they do game plan for the preseason. But in theory, if they're to be believed, if no one is game planning, then it's unfortunate that they were able to telegraph a screen so easily. And other times, inaccuracy, which is uncharacteristic, happens, and that's a problem. And then, of course, there were a couple of drops too. Someone said that Stephon Diggs, or not someone, the general consensus is that Stephon Diggs had a drop on a slant. I don't know if I'd qualify that as a drop, because I would say that was like a pass deflection or whatever. And I would say I'd put that more on the defender than anyone on offense. And if I were to put it on offense, I'd say, maybe the quarterback shouldn't throw a ball that's, as easily to defend. as someone who's well covered as that. But for the most part, yeah, kind of disappointing by the offense, but not something I would say is fundamentally, concerning going forward. Like, yeah, okay, so it's the game where they had the most runtime with the starters, and they were up against the easiest teams that they're going to play all preseason, and they kind of crapped the bed. That sounds alarming when you put it all together like that, but what was it, like 25 snaps for the offense, and you compare it to like the 30 or so snaps they had in the previous two preseason games, and I'd say I would take more positives than negatives out of the whole preseason, even if the offense overall was kind of annoying.
So Kirk Cousins after the game, and I quote, "If we play that way during the season, it's going to be a very tough year." Well, thanks.
That's no relax.
Yeah, we have to be much better than we were on Saturday. And I really should say I have to be much better than I was. It's about as simple as that. And that was kind of, I don't know if that was directly a reflection of his relatively poor play and just letting the Vikings be kind of dominated at every stage of the game in the first half, both time of possession, offensive production. The shining lights of the offense were basically Dalvin Cook and my boy Kyle Sloter. Dalvin topping out at about 19.7 miles an hour on that big long run that he broke out. And, the defense, I think, it's been a minute since I've watched the Vikings with any kind of critical eye or any regularity. But, you get the impression that our veteran core is starting to get old and perhaps a little rusty with, particularly when, Xavier Rhodes has never been full season consistent, but man, he had kind of a rough game.
He did. It was mostly because of the one throw to Damiere Byrd. We have a mailbag question about this. I'll just address it right here. Is Xavier Rhodes cooked? And I think that the answer is we don't have enough information, which is unfortunate. I'd rather the answer just be no. But that rep looked really bad. The broadcast angle gave us basically the entire route, so we could actually just see the whole thing. And Rhodes just looked unathletic. He looked like his legs were just worn out and tired. He missed a press, and so that happens. And so your job as a cornerback when you miss on the press is to recover, and he couldn't recover quickly enough. And it didn't look like he had the athleticism that he's had in years past. And a lot of people have mentioned that they never really thought of Rhodes as kind of a faster corner, and I think that's kind of funny. He ran a 4.41 at the combine. That was kind of one of his, he was big, strong, long, and explosive. That was his thing coming out of the combine. But he ran a 4.41, and speed has always been a big part of his game. His inability to kind of turn around and get to that point is alarming, but also not something I would say is reason to kind of push the panic button just yet. This was his only bad game in the preseason thus far. His previous two games, you didn't get targeted all that often. And also the offense wasn't, or the first team defense wasn't on the field all that often. But, you want to take those snaps in conjunction with this snap. And I would say he actually had a pretty good training camp. If I was going to take a look at kind of which of the two cornerbacks, the starting outside cornerbacks, had trouble in training camp, it'd be Trey Waynes, who is kind of more continuously cooked by Thielen and Diggs than Xavier Rhodes was, who really was only ever beaten when it was kind of a deep sideline pass and they had really great, ball placement. So I'm not concerned yet. But I won't say that that's not a worrying sign, if that makes sense. So, yeah, he had a bad game, mostly because of the big Damiere Byrd play, but he did make up for it later, and he was targeted more than once. So, a concern, but not something I would say is a sign that, hey, he's done or anything like that.
Well, luckily I was wrong when I appeared last season to make a very jinx-worthy prediction that the Vikings would lose Dalvin Cook to injury at a crucial point in the season. It's an easy thing to trot out. But I am a little bit concerned that with, Mike Hughes coming back from ACL tear and Xavier Rhodes being Xavier Rhodes, that when the team is firing on all cylinders defensively, like if everybody's healthy, then, a pretty strong first team. But I feel like we're one or two injuries away from a much more difficult climb.
Yeah, I think so. And that's been kind of the discussion that has been kind of dominating a lot of the Vikings preseason and training camp, is kind of what happens when the first line of the defense goes down. Now, obviously, not everybody's going to go down. We're not going to face a situation where throughout the season, at some point, everybody's been injured. But, can you sustain an injury at safety? What about at corner? What about at linebacker? What about defensive end? What about defensive tackle? Defensive end, I'm very comfortable with the depth that they have there with both Afadi Odenigbo and Stephen Weatherly. And then at some point, Deshaun Bauer might come off of PUP. I assume he's going to start the season on PUP. If he comes off of PUP and there's already a free roster spot because of an injury, then he's on the team, and now you've got additional defensive end depth. Not only that, at defensive tackle, the talent that they have at defensive tackle, that there's a reason that, beat writers keep on trying to put, including me, trying to put 10 defensive linemen on the final 53. So there's a lot of good defensive tackles. So that's kind of not where the issue is. At linebacker, I'm not as concerned as I have been in previous years. Eric Wilson's a great coverage linebacker. That matters a lot more than pass rush or run defense. But beyond that, Ben Gideon has been playing really well as a run defender. And I really like what I'm seeing out of the final, kind of the back end, like the Cameron Smith, Rashard Clatts. And so the issue is really at cornerback. Safety, you've got Jaron Kearse, who, maybe you don't like him as a deep safety, but, he's got a lot of versatility and movement. Marcus Epps is there, and then Deron Smith might make the team as an AAF guy. They're interesting. They're not, necessarily huge drop-offs, but at cornerback, that's the big concern. And it just happens to be the most important position on any defense, and in particular the Vikings defense, where they put the corners on islands a little bit more often. Xavier Rhodes goes down in week 1 or 2. I'm not sure we have an answer. Week 3, maybe Mike Hughes is back and healthy enough to play, or week 4, something like that. Early on, you'll have Mike Hughes, and that's going to be, hopefully he doesn't have a ton of rust coming back. A guy comes back from injury and you immediately have to play him. That's not great. But, you've got Mike Hughes, who's inherently just kind of a more talented guy, and he was a first-round pick for a reason, and he still is carrying the kind of the reputation of being, the guy that Mike Zimmer said picked up the defense faster than any rookie cornerback he's ever had. So there's a guy that I think we can be reasonably confident is a good depth guy. After the first 8 weeks, you have Holton Hill. He's a guy that I think is a starting quality cornerback. So you've got depth there. And so the question is, weeks 1 and 2, who do you have? And then between weeks like 4 and 8, who do you have if there's another injury? And I don't think there's a good answer. And I think most teams wouldn't have a good answer if you have to go to your fourth corner. But I just think because the Vikings have so often faced cornerback injury issues, even kind of before the Xavier Rhodes saga, it's just a more pressing thing for the Vikings and for Vikings fans. Xavier Rhodes obviously missed a lot of time last year. I think what surprises a lot of people is that Trey Waynes actually missed even more time than Xavier Rhodes did. And so, what do you do then? I don't love who they have. They just released Bene Benwickery at corner, and I think it's important to say, hey, they released Jordan Taylor and Bene Benwickery because they're veterans, so they would not go through the waiver process. I think the Vikings are waiting to cut anybody eligible for waivers on cut down day so that anybody the Vikings are targeting on waivers might get caught up in a team targeting somebody they're going to cut on waivers, if that makes sense. So they might put a waiver claim on, say, whoever the 49ers are cutting at receiver, or the Colts or the Chargers or whatever, right? And another team was going to put a waiver claim on that guy, but instead they decided to put a waiver claim on, one of the guys that the Vikings cut. So I think that's why they're waiting to cut, just as an aside. But I think that, I don't trust Duke Thomas. I don't think he's been very good throughout camp. He's had, I think, one good preseason game, and mostly because of, I think, circumstance. And then Nate Metters has been moved to safety for a reason. Isaiah Wharton has been moved to safety for a reason. Chris Boyd has been tremendously disappointing. And so I just don't think they've got that depth. But they have the players, right? They have the players to have depth. They just don't have the availability of those players.
Yeah, far be it for the NFL to have Byzantine rules about anything, but I guess that kind of goes to, that was another question that had popped up in the mailbag is, why cut veterans this far before the cut date if you don't have anybody to replace them with? And, perhaps it's just a matter of trying to, I guess, induce other players or other teams to pick up veteran players just because the rules for that it's a lot. We're not going to go into all the details of what does not.
There are potentially strategic reasons.
Yes. But yeah, Jordan Taylor didn't make the cut either. Jordan Taylor, we hardly knew ye. And I think both of those guys were on the team for a combined, 9 weeks?
Well, no, and Taylor's been on the team since March.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, Ben Wickery was on the team for...
They signed him just early August, right?
3 weeks, maybe? Yeah, it was, yeah.
So then, like you were saying, the rest of the roster cuts will probably happen much closer to the deadline, with the eventual goal of potentially picking up a couple of those guys to play on the practice squad. So now we approach the final interview for probably 10 players on both the Vikings and the Bills at this point.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see who plays, right? Because that'll tell us enough about kind of who's a lock to make the roster. So if CJ Ham doesn't play, there goes my Kari Blessingham dreams. But yeah, the number of players that play will tell us kind of who's a lock and who's not. And then a number of the players that are playing are essentially locks, right? Like I can't imagine the Vikings are going to trot out the second team offensive line. I can't imagine that Brett Jones doesn't make the team, for example. So really, like you said, the key players are probably the players that are in between the second and third team. And so there's going to be critical roster making plays made by about a total universe of about 10 players on either team.
Bills 3-0 in preseason, just like the Vikings. Ooh. For whatever that's worth.
Oh.
Beating the Colts and the Panthers and the Lions so far.
Oh my.
I know. Tough year for the animal teams against the Buffalo Bills. So of the players that are kind of on the bubble for the Bills, what do you expect in terms of matchups? Is this... first of all, does it even matter if the Vikings win this game, or is it really just about how well players perform, both matchup wise and kind of on the team balance sheet?
Yeah, naturally, it doesn't really matter if the Vikings win. The Vikings tend to approach these preseason games a lot more like games than a lot of other teams do, which is probably one of the reasons they have such a tremendous preseason record. 20-4, 19-4, something like that. I want to say 20-4 because they had 5 preseason games one year. But yeah, it doesn't matter if they win, but they treat the games like the game situations in preseason games are what they would actually do in regular season games. And so they treat the 2-minute drill like a 2-minute drill. They don't put a 2-minute drill somewhere else in the game, that sort of thing. So, it doesn't matter if they win, but, and it doesn't even tell us that much about their depth if they in fact win, because I think the play calling for the Vikings tends to be a little bit different than the play calling for other teams. But yeah, all of the individual matchups kind of matter a lot more, how those individual players play. And so for that, obviously it'd be nice to kind of figure out, how various players in the bubble are doing and kind of match them up against kind of whoever the Bills are putting out there. But, just like we're not entirely sure who the Vikings are willing to just kind of put on the field, we're obviously also not completely sure who the Bills are going to put out on the field. We know Josh Allen's not going to be out there. He's their starting quarterback. We know they'll probably put Matt Barkley out there because he's their backup quarterback. But, along the offensive line, I don't know if Ty Nsekhe is going to be out there, right? Because I think, he's competing to be a tackle, but they've had Cody Ford play both tackle and guard, right? And so if Cody Ford is a guard, then they'll play Ty Nsekhe at tackle, and then you won't have Ty Nsekhe to go up against, and he'd be a great matchup for Stephen Weatherly or Afadi Adenabo. But I think beyond that, like we can take a look at some of the players that are kind of interesting, like David Sills, undrafted free agent from West Virginia, kind of a big body receiver. The story about him that I'm sure West Virginia fans and Bills fans are now sick to death of hearing of, it's kind of like the Detroit Lakes Adam Thielen thing, is that he was offered to be a quarterback at USC when he was in 8th grade. And then he got injured a bunch in high school. They pulled his offer because Lane Kiffin left USC and or was fired. And then he goes to a community college, becomes a wide receiver, and ends up being a killer wide receiver, goes to West Virginia, becomes a top wide receiver prospect. And then, of course, like the person throwing to him, Will Greer, his brother, is like an Instagram superstar. So that's hilarious to me. But yeah, David Sills is kind of like this red zone matchup kind of guy. Kind of like a poor man's Brandon Marshall or Eric Decker, just kind of the big body guy that pulls in a bunch of touchdowns, but not a ton of yards. So, seeing how they kind of do in the red zone against that kind of body is going to matter. I think the Bills generally have decent receiver depth after that has been an issue for them for the past couple of years. So we're probably not going to see Cole Beasley, Zay Jones, or John Brown, but we could see Robert Foster, who's this deep speed guy, Andre Roberts, who's a great slot guy, Ray McLeod, kind of an all-around guy, Isaiah McKenzie, a guy that was previously with the Broncos that I kind of liked. Those receiver matchups will probably mean a lot for, your Duke Thomases and, even we might even see Mackenzie Alexander out there on the outside to see if he has outside depth and see kind of what he can do against these different types of receiver styles. I think once you go past that, you can take a look at some of the tight ends. They have a ton of tight ends, including former Viking Kyle Carter, as well as the guy that torched the Vikings, Jason Kroom, who's one of the most embarrassing kind of defensive blown coverages of last year's when Jason Kroom was open on a scramble, 58 yards, something like that, touchdown. He's got a decent amount of inherent talent that's going to provide some interesting matchups for the linebacker core. And we know that those linebackers, there's the possibility that they keep 7 in an era when a bunch of teams only want to keep 5 because of how pass happy the NFL is. They really like, Cameron Smith, and they really like Rashard Cliette, and they want to see if Kentrell Brothers is somebody that's worth keeping on the roster because he's been such an amazingly good, special teamer for them. We only know that Eric Wilson and Van Gideon are definitely going to be there. And then after that, what about Devontae Downs? He had an excellent sack in the last game, and, I've got him just barely cut in favor of Cliette and Smith, but I mean it's just barely an edge, and so he can move himself back up. And how these tight end matchups play out is, I think, going to be a big part of that. They've got a bunch of players with a fair amount of experience, and then some tight ends that people liked in the draft, like Tommy Sweeney. So that's going to be kind of interesting. How that backfield shakes up is going to be kind of interesting. So I imagine Frank Gore and LaShawn McCoy aren't going to play, but they've got 3rd round pick Devin Singletary. He was a favorite of a lot of people in the draft, but they've also got, guys with a history of production like TJ Yeldon, who, at Jacksonville, I would say maybe outperformed Leonard Fournette, but, nobody in Jacksonville would ever want to say that. They've got Christian Wade, a former rugby player, who's one of the fastest rugby players in, I don't know if it's rugby union or rugby league. Please don't terrorize me when I say stuff like that. But, one of the fastest players in his league or division or conference or whatever it is. And his speed has shown up in NFL games. I think he was like the 3rd fastest ball carrier by Next Gen Stats in week 1. The fastest being a kick returner who, for the Browns, who has this amazing story. So on offense, there's a bunch of potentially interesting matchups. Ike Betker, who is one of the offensive linemen. I think he's originally from Iowa. He's a waiver picker from Kansas City. Spencer Long, Wyatt Teller, who I think is a Virginia Tech draft pick from 2 years ago. They've all got like an inherent amount of talent that I think could potentially put the Vikings into a situation where the defensive line actually gets tested with that depth. So I think offensively, there's a bunch of interesting stuff until you get to like the quarterback who, they've got Matt Barkley, who is a backup, but I would say he's in the lower half of backups. He's not that great. And then they've got undrafted free agent Tyree Jackson, who is basically Josh Allen, but bigger and with a very long windup and possibly more inaccurate. A person high, obviously, I don't think is a huge test in terms of whether or not he's likely to beat them. So outside of quarterback, there's a bunch of interesting matchups that could provide us with a lot of interesting details, especially on the second team offense, about what the Vikings can do depth wise on defense.
So the Bills recently signed former Viking Captain Munnerlyn, and he's been taking a lot of the slot corner reps. Do you think that kind of pushes out Lafayette Pitts, or will we see Pitts playing for his job against the Vikings?
That's actually pretty interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if we even saw Captain Munnerlyn as well. Who knows kind of what their plan is, but I kind of like the whole cornerback setup they have over there. So Lafayette Pitts is there, Ryan Lewis is there, former New England guy, Kevin Johnson, former Texan, a guy who was a former first-round pick in the same class as Trey Waynes. And admittedly, I have to admit that I did like him more than Trey Waynes, so I was definitely wrong about that. Saran Neal, who has had a history of some pretty excellent college play. He was a kind of a standout at the Senior Bowl 2 years ago. They've got kind of an interesting setup in terms of what they're going to do at cornerback that I think, hey, we're going to see, if BC Johnson really, if he's going to play even, because he's warming up with the starters and key reserves in warm-ups before practices these past 2 days. But if BC Johnson can get open against Captain Munnerlyn, that's great, because the point, the kind of the appeal of his scouting report is that he can play all three positions. So if he plays in the slot, against Munnerlyn or even Lafayette Pitts, who's not that bad, I would say that would probably tell us some interesting stuff too. They've got a couple of former Vikings. They've also got Kurt Coleman, who is in Vikings camp, who I would say, a lot of people were kind of upset that he got cut. And then, of course, he leads the league in picks among safeties in Philadelphia. That'll be interesting. So at safety, that's a kind of a guy that you maybe want to take a look at. But just generally, I think that secondary is going to provide us with a couple of interesting matchups. I think the defensive line is kind of the same way. I don't know how I feel about the Bucs linebackers. I think their starters are really tremendously good. And I think their backups are guys that I wouldn't say are in kind of the same category as a lot of these backup cornerbacks and backup defenders. So that's kind of the more interesting area. I think when you take a look kind of going forward, you take a look at those defensive linemen. I don't know if Shaq Lawson is going to play. I don't know if Harrison Phillips is going to play, but both of those guys are pretty well regarded. From my understanding, the Bills starters are Ed Oliver, who's, the first-round pick, Trent Murphy, who they grabbed from Washington, super underrated edge rusher, might be competing with Shaq Lawson for that starting job. Star Lotulelei, who they grabbed from the Panthers, a really excellent kind of nose tackle that has the ability to play some 3 technique. And then Jerry Hughes, who ate Riley Reif for lunch again last year. Now, in fairness, Reif was injured and should not have been playing in that game. But it creates kind of the situation where kind of further down the depth chart, you end up with some guys that are pretty interesting. Jordan Phillips, who they grabbed from Miami, interesting nose tackle type, and Daryl Johnson, a 7th round pick that ended up testing through the roof. I thought he was a potential, I think he's North Carolina A&T or something like that. I thought he was a potential Vikings target kind of late in the draft, just because they always seem to grab those super athletic edge rushers. But yeah, I think those guys can really kind of put some interesting challenges in front of an offensive line where the depth is a bit of a concern, because we don't expect Avion Collins to play. You've got Storm Norton at right tackle, because Rashad Hill, I think, is unlikely to play. He could play, though. But if he doesn't, you've got Storm Norton at right tackle. And then at left tackle, you've got Dakota Dozier, who's been a guard in the NFL. He played tackle, I think, 40-odd straight starts in college. So he's got tackle experience, but, he's asked to play guard because, he doesn't quite necessarily have the speed to play tackle. This game, I think, will tell us a lot about Dakota Dozier, because if he can hold up against, Shaq Lawson and whoever the pass rushing linebackers happen to be, maybe Julian Stanford, then, it'd be easier to kind of put him on the 53 and then hope Oliudo clears waivers and stuff like that. So that'll tell us, I think, a little bit more about the tackles. I am pretty confident about the backup interior offensive lineman, which is not something I've said a lot, mostly because of Brett Jones. I think that, he's been playing tremendously good this preseason. We'll get to see him go up against a powerful nose tackle in Jordan Phillips, and then also a guy who's remarkably productive at Stanford and Harrison Phillips. Although he's not likely to play guard, so he's probably not going to see Harrison Phillips as much. But yeah, how Danny Isidora does, how, if Drew Samia is promoted to the second team, kind of what he does in light of all the injuries. Yeah, I think that the Bills will provide us with kind of those appropriate tests. The only issue is at linebacker, when those players move up to the second level to block, being able to shut down Corey Thompson, I don't know what that means. He doesn't seem like a guy I've heard of before, so maybe he's not that great. Beating Voshawn Joseph to the edge, he's a 5th round pick for a reason. That's not as interesting to me. If Cole Hikatini, burns past Tyrell Dodson deep down the seam, great. I don't know what that tells us. So that's kind of the only area where I would say, maybe this doesn't give us as much information.
Let's be honest. Nobody really cares about the Bills, not even Bills fans. If there's any other team whose kind of 53-man roster situation matters most to the Vikings, it's got to be our hated arch nemesis, the Green Bay Packers, right?
Yeah, what's kind of curious there is they're a little bit stronger at linebacker than they were a couple days ago. So the tragic thinness that they had at inside linebacker with Oren Brooks' injury, that's been kind of resolved. But yeah, they've got a bunch of interesting names to look out for because at receiver, again, so Equanimeous St. Brown injured, Jake Kumaro gets promoted to the second team, but they still got a lot of players that I wouldn't mind kind of kicking the tires. If they've got another return option, they don't have to go with Trevor Davis, so he could be kind of a guy that you could take a look at. As much as I hate North Dakota State, Darius Shepard is a guy that you could take a look at that I think could potentially add. Because, the Vikings, there's 4 receivers that you can be confident are making the team now that BC Johnson has kind of secured himself a spot. It's Chad Beebe, BC Johnson, then, of course, the 2 starters, Diggs and Thielen. Then after that, you could replace one of them with, say, Jamon Moore, who's continuously looked good in Packers camp the past 2 years. You could take a look at Alan Lazard, who I don't actually think is all that good, but people tend to get excited about, giant humans playing receiver. You could take a look at him, right? So, that's interesting. I think the Packers tend to have depth on the offensive line, and I think this year is no different. If Josh Nijman, I think Virginia Tech, doesn't make the team, and I don't know what their 53-man projection looks like, but, he's an undrafted free agent, every chance in the world he doesn't make the team, and if he doesn't, he's a guy I'd kind of take a look at again. Is Manny Wilkins or Tim Boyle better than Kyle Slater? Probably not. But, they always tend to have a third quarterback that always intrigues us. So, that's something that you could take a look at. And then I think defensively, what happens at defensive back for them, if Kadar Holman doesn't make the team, he's a super athlete. Maybe you can have him, as a waiver pickup at cornerback, right? And that gives you a little bit of intel on kind of what the Packers defense is going to try to do. Trey Matthews at safety, former Viking. Maybe you could pick him up if you kind of maybe are considering moving Marcus Epps to cornerback to deal with the cornerback depth issues. So yeah, there's a couple of interesting things that they could do that impact the Vikings. They've also got a kicker. Maybe take a look at that too. Sam Ficken, who's been playing pretty well in the preseason, but he's not likely to unseat Mason Crosby. Maybe you could just give up on the guy you just traded a 5th round pick for and grab that guy. So a couple of interesting things that the Packers could do that could directly impact the Vikings, just because they've got a lot of depth at positions where the Vikings definitely need to round out their depth chart.
So that's that. Is that? Then that is that. Let's turn our attention to a mailbag replete with questions. So many, in fact, that we've already answered a few of them in line. But you mentioned our kicking situation and a certain guy that we traded a 5th round pick for. Ben writes in, any thoughts on what is at this point clearly a curse on Vikings place kickers, with Vedvik missing those 2 field goal kicks? Could it possibly have anything to do with a certain fantasy football league scoring rules for place kickers? Well, that's giving us, I think, more power than we deserve, although it's a nice thing to think about, at least for me.
Right. Yeah. It would tell us that we've got more control over the universe than we have, and that's always nice. But yeah, I don't know. So here's the thing. I reached out when the Vikings traded for Corey Vedvik. I reached out to a couple of the guys that have been at Ravens training camp, and I was like, "Hey, so how's he been looking?" And in 2018, he looked great as a kicker, as a punter. In camp, apparently, he had been missing a number of field goal kicks. And I looked online to see if they had published this information, and they hadn't, so I didn't really feel comfortable saying, hey, according to hashtag sources, he's missing all kinds of field goals in camp. They didn't publish it, so I just didn't feel super comfortable with it. But it's now kind of come out that that's what Ravens beat writers felt, that he wasn't doing great kicking field goals in camp, which I find fascinating because they have a lot of contacts with the Ravens special teams. I mean, Marwan Malouf talks about how he knows the Ravens special teams coaches really well and that he trusts those guys. And he would know that Vedvik's been missing a bunch of kicks, right? Or his friends lie to him. Either way, you should probably have a handle on that. That's fascinating to me. He made his extra point kick, so that's cool. Don't want to lose sight of that. But, the Vikings traded a 5th round pick for a guy that is probably not going to clear waivers if they cut him. So they can't do the unusual move of putting a kicker on the practice squad. But that's kind of what I would aim for if I were them, because Bailey's looked great. Matt Weil has looked great since they traded for Corey Vedvik. And the thing is, I looked at a thread on Twitter today, which is, we basically argued how a player kicks in camp is going to tell us a lot more about the season than how a player kicks in the preseason, which I understand. That's like a sample size argument. I would say it's difficult to compare the two because the tremendous sample size of camp is not analogous to the limited sample size of the preseason, because the preseason, has, more authentic to NFL game samples, because you've got guys that are more willing to take on contact as they try to block the kick. Those kick blockers come on faster. You have to be more accurate with your timing as a kicker. And there's always the possibility that you'll get hurt. Where in camp, in practices, that possibility is diminished, although obviously not zero. So I would say kind of the quote unquote pressure of the preseason changes. So the samples are not 1-to-1, but I would say that's an interesting argument. The thing is, both Bailey and Weil have been much better in practices too, since Corey Vedvik arrived. So I don't know what to do with that. Now, you could make the argument, and it certainly seems to be the case, that the Vikings spent a 5th round pick to in some way improve at both kicker and punter. And their kicker and punter have improved, but not quite in the direct manner as you would have associated. So did the Vikings improve by spending a 5th round pick on a guy at their specialist positions? Yes. And if you end up with the Dan Bailey of old and a Matt Weil who more consistently punts, has better hang time, and has the potential to directionally punt and kind of pin it at the 5 or even just at the 7, is it worth it? And I would say yes, actually. The reason I don't like spending draft picks on kickers or punters is not because a kicker and punter is worth less at the top of their game than a typical 5th round draft pick. In fact, I would say they're worth quite a bit more than a typical 5th round draft pick. So the cost of having a high level kicker or punter, much less both, because it's seemingly they've improved both, I would say is much better than the cost of a 5th round offensive lineman or whatever, just in terms of the value to the team. But the reason I don't like spending those picks is because you don't ever get the top kicker or punter in the NFL with a pick. They're almost always undrafted. And in fact, if you bring in 2 undrafted guys, the likelihood that you'll end up with a kicker or punter that's better than your 5th round guy is actually not that bad. I mean, if you just take a look at the number of undrafted specialists in the NFL that are signed in on 90-man rosters and look at their success rate versus the success rate of drafted kickers and punters, it's not that different. So that's the only reason I don't like spending picks. That's not the same when you trade. When you trade, you're not spending a 5th round pick on a guy that's a completely unknown commodity. Vedvik has had a year with the Ravens, and he's had a bunch of practices that have allowed the Vikings to gather intel, which seemingly that's faulty intel. Who knows? But if the trade has produced a guy that is not that good, but has somehow manufactured an increase in a kicker and punter, I would say that 5th round pick is worth it, even if they cut him. So they shouldn't be afraid of this sunk cost thing if suddenly magically their other guys are better. Just take it and get rid of the guy and hope he clears waivers that you can, develop him on the practice squad or whatever.
Well, so kind of on that same topic, a couple of different versions of what is essentially the same question. Do the Vikings, after all of this kicker nonsense, settles down in advance of the season, do the Vikings scheme in a way that makes it more likely for them to go for it on 4th and short or try for 2-point conversions?
I mean, I would just like it. Like that would be.
You should do that.
Yeah, that would be smarter football. I was talking to Benjamin Morris at Skeptical Sports. He's an analytics guy that tends to be very suspicious of the analytics community. And he thinks that analytics people tend to overstate the case of going for it. He's got a bunch of interesting takes that are kind of like that. He makes a good argument that you should still probably value kickers and punters, but just generally, I think the Vikings have been too conservative on 4th down, especially in I think some people call it the maroon zone, where you're not quite in the red zone, but you're not in a position where punting is obviously better. Kind of like around 40 yards out, right? If you're 40 yards from the end zone, what's that?
Are you afraid to call it the pink zone?
Well, you're mixing red and green, you get brown. So
no one wants to be in the brown zone.
Yeah, that's
pretty clear.
That's unless you're into some anyway.
No, edit. No.
Yeah. So if you're in the pink zone, let's just call it that. If you're in the pink zone, you should probably go for it. Because punting is, you gain about 30 yards of field position, and that's when going for it tends to just be better. Unless, it's 4th and 8, right? Then it's just probably don't. Anything 4th and 5 and closer, you should probably go for it. And I would like it if the Vikings were so uncertain of their punting situation that they just went for it so often. But at the same time, that would mean that when they punt from their own end zone, they just don't really trust the guy. And maybe they're right, and he only punts at 30 yards. So maybe that's not end up net worth it. But still, I would say that if, because of this, at the beginning of the season, they just happened to go for it on 4th down in the pink zone more often, and they maybe kick from a little further out or choose 2-point conversions a little bit more often. Yeah, I would like that. And also, I think 2-point conversions, I don't think they should be mandatory, but I would like that to be the norm, where you'd rather go for a 2-point conversion, just because the scores are weirder and cooler, and there's a wider variance in scoring. Everybody gains 7 points all the time, but if it's 6 or 8 and they add up in unpredictable ways, like it's 6, 8, and 8, then it's weird and fun scoring. I like that. Do that.
Anything that reduces the number of field goal attempts, I feel like, is not just good for the Vikings, but good for the game of football.
Yeah.
Let's see. Boy, it was so clear that I would be hosting this week that there are questions from me in the mailbag. Does any player have a more delicious name than Taco Charlton?
That was one of your questions.
Yeah.
I thought about this, and I didn't do enough to really investigate. I went through Pro Football Reference to see if there was somebody named Frito in the NFL, and I couldn't find one. Frito with a T, not Fredo. Yeah, the slur against Italian Americans, apparently.
Who knew?
Who knew? I couldn't find that. There's nobody named Pizza in Pro Football Reference. I couldn't find anybody. There is a guy named Fred Chicken, which is a lot like fried chicken. I would say that's probably more delicious. He was born in Minneapolis, and he played for the is this Rhode Island? The Rock Island Independence in 1920. So Fred Chicken.
Reaching way back.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you do the PFR search, it's kind of what you have to do. There's nobody named Beef in the NFL yet, but there's a college player named Kobe Buffalo Meat. So